Number 5. Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler. The Allied forces sent thousands of B-17 bombers into Nazi-occupied territory during World War II to destroy Hitler's war machine from up above. And on December 20th, 1943, members of the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the 8th United States Air Force were given orders to bomb the Focke-Wulf 190 factory, which was in Bremen, Germany. The area, though, was heavily guarded by a whopping 250 anti-aircraft guns. The bomber, named Ye Old Pub, was assigned to a section of the formation called the Purple Heart Corner due to threats from the enemy. This was also the bomber's first mission ever. The B-17 managed to reach the target, but during its arrival it was hit several times by anti-aircraft fire. The plexiglass of Ye Old Pub's nose was shattered by the impacts, and its second engine was knocked out. Engine number 4 also sustained heavy damage, but understanding that they had a job to do, the bomber's pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Charlie Brown, dropped their bombs on target before heading back home. Unfortunately, though, thanks to the damage done to his aircraft, Charlie started to fall behind and fell out of formation with the rest of his squad. Once he was alone in the sky, Ye Old Pub was bombarded by dozens of German fighters. This onslaught resulted in even more damage to the plane's third engine, the rudder, the oxygen supply, the electrical systems, and even the hydraulics. And the cold air, which was at least minus 76 degrees Fahrenheit, started to flow right through the damaged nose of the bomber, causing many of the B-17's machine guns to freeze up. Out of the 11 guns they started out with, the men aboard the Ye Old Pub were down to only 3. And at this point, the tail gunner had been killed, and most of the other crew members on the bomber were incredibly wounded. The men discussed bailing out of the aircraft, but they worried that if they did, one of them wouldn't land safely. This was when Ye Old Pub was spotted by Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler, whose fighter was being rearmed and refueled. And although he was on the German side, he took off immediately to try and help the crew of the B-17 bomber, who were in dire straits. When he reached the damaged plane, Stigler could see just how wounded the crew was through the many holes in the side of the aircraft. Stigler had once studied to become a priest, so he touched the beads of his rosary, which he kept on him at all times. The man's moral code wouldn't let him kill the innocent men aboard the Ye Old Pub. Charlie and the rest of the men were shocked by the compassion given to them by an enemy pilot. Stigler tried to get Charlie to fly to neutral Sweden or land at a German airfield, but Charlie didn't understand what the German pilot was trying to say, so the B-17 continued flying home. Stigler still wanted to protect Ye Old Pub and its crew though, so he brought his Messerschmitt Bf-109 right next to the bomber in order to stop German anti-aircraft guns from targeting the B-17. Stigler then continued flying alongside the enemy plane until they finally reached open water, which is when Stigler gave the men aboard the Ye Old Pub a salute before going back to base. Charlie ended up landing the plane at an RAF field and couldn't believe that they'd made it out of the air alive. The B-17 pilot told his commander about the heroic German fighter who'd saved them, but he was told to keep it a secret. Stigler was also forced to stay silent out of fears of being court-martialed and killed for saving the enemy crew. But for years after the war ended, Charlie thought about the pilot who saved him and his fellow soldiers' lives. He even told the amazing story at pilot reunions and searched military archives for any mention of the brave man. But it wasn't until January 1990, after Charlie had put out an ad in a former Luftwaffe pilot's newsletter, that he received a message from Stigler, who'd moved to Canada after the war and managed to become a successful businessman. The letter Stigler wrote said, "Dear Charles, all these years I've wondered what happened to that B-17. Did she make it home? Did her crew survive their wounds? To hear of your survival has filled me with indescribable joy." After reading these few words, Charlie used directory assistance and found Stigler's home number, and within a few minutes, the two pilots who had served on opposite sides of the war connected over the phone and shared details they remembered from that day. Then, later that same year, the men met up in person for the first time at a hotel in Florida. That initial meeting led to a strong friendship, and over the years they'd visited each other often and would go on fishing trips. They would even attend pilot reunions together. It was as if Stigler had gained a brother after losing so many friends and family members in the war. In 2008, the two pilots passed away within a few months of each other, when Charlie was 87 and Stigler was 92. And while most people think all Nazi soldiers were evil, This story serves as a reminder that even if you're on the wrong side of a fight, you can still choose to do the right thing. Number 4. Hitler saves America? Germany's biologists accomplished a lot during World War II, and they even figured out how to make bioweapons. America was one target the Nazis debated using these terrifying bioweapons against, but in the end, it never happened. And surprisingly, that's thanks to the last person you'd expect, Adolf Hitler. In 1943, a Nazi scientist recommended that America be attacked with various animal and human epidemic pathogens, and plant pests as well. This was completely feasible considering the extraordinary advances the Germans had made during the war. By that point, the Nazis had already conducted a series of insane insect-related tests, and they'd even played with the idea of unleashing 40 million weaponized potato beetles over crops in the UK. But again, this didn't happen. Although there's likely an alternate reality where people remember Beatlemania, a time when half the population of Britain starved thanks to Nazi bugs. During the war, German scientists also figured out how to weaponize multiple human diseases, including cholera, typhoid, and the awful spore-forming bacterium known as anthrax. The synthetic medium they'd created to keep the diseases active and dangerous for weeks was strangely considered an outstanding achievement by scientists in the United States, who discovered it when they raided Nazi laboratories after the war. So why didn't the Germans use these tactics against their enemies? The answer is simple. The man in charge simply didn't like it. Early on in the war, Hitler issued an order that stated that any research regarding offensive biological weapons was forbidden. But Nazi scientists blatantly ignored the order and continued to do it anyway. But Hitler refused to change his mind about bioweapons when he was later informed that Germany now had weapons capable of mass destruction. It's not exactly clear why Hitler was against using these, since he was okay with committing other unspeakable atrocities, but there are some theories. Hitler could have had a bad personal experience with bioweapons during the time he served in World War I, and maybe he just didn't want to subject others to the kind of torture he'd experienced firsthand. Or perhaps he just considered all science in general to be an elaborate Jewish plot. Hitler was also high on bull semen and cocaine throughout most of the conflict, so it could have been a combination of these three things. Still, you'd assume that selling Hitler on the idea of wiping out America would be a relatively easy task. But that's not exactly what happened, and the dictator didn't budge on his stance even a little bit throughout the war. So what's the moral of this story? Even evil people are capable of making some good decisions, even if that decision is sandwiched by a bunch of bad ones. But just because Hitler chose not to use bioweapons doesn't make him a saint, and in our eyes, and likely everyone else's eyes, he's still a terrible person who should be remembered as such. Why do you think Hitler refused to use bioweapons? Let us know in the comments down below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel while you're at it. Number 3. Cigarettes in World War II. In the year 1900, cigarettes were considered a huge trend in the US, and these cancer sticks were typically smoked by kids or immigrants. The upper and middle classes, though, preferred to smoke cigars or pipes. In the First World War, the US government started appropriating cash to put American cigarettes into common rations of troops. They did this with the hopes that cigarettes would charm doughboys enough for them to stay away from the more serious vices like opium, which was widely available at the time throughout all of Europe. And by 1920, cigarette use had almost tripled in the US to 20%. Tobacco was considered by the government to be such an important commodity that farm programs were created that paid farmers not to grow tobacco plants and grow necessary food crops, portraying cigars and pipes as something only gangsters and snobs used. And by the time the Second World War came around, a partnership between the US government and cigarette makers had already been made. Once again, smokes were included in the rations of American soldiers. Officers in the army were awarded Lucky Strikes and Camels, while the enlisted men were limited to simple Chesterfields, Pall Mall, and rolled gold. And this, of course, was resented by the common soldiers. Billions of cigarettes were already donated to the war effort by tobacco companies, but good old Uncle Sam brought millions more on top of that. The precise numbers aren't exactly known, but it's been estimated that the government purchased around 55 billion smokes for the military, and that was in 1 year alone. American cigarettes could easily be traded by US servicemen for intelligence from prisoners, booze, food, and even sex in some cases. If there ever was a soldier who didn't smoke, they could sell their cigarettes to fellow squad mates for cash. Cigarettes were also used in gambling. There were even some military rest camps in Europe that were literally brand-named camps, like Camp Lucky Strike and Camp Camel. The Marshall Plan for rebuilding Europe after the war included a whopping $1 billion in American cigarettes and tobacco, and in today's currency, that's over $15 billion. And by 1949, American flu-cured type tobacco had taken Europe by storm, with surveys showing that 85 to 90% of Germans preferred American tobacco instead of the Greek or Turkish varieties they knew before the war. Even in the 1980s, a carton of American-made Marlboros was a coveted prize, and so the U.S. bases overseas began to limit how many smokes American troops could buy, since they could sell them to the locals at exorbitant prices. And now, the famous quote by George Washington, "If you can't send them money, send them tobacco." Makes much more sense. Number 2. The Ghost Army. The Ghost Army, or the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops Soldier Unit, used misinformation to deceive the enemy throughout Europe. The unit was full of artists who'd been plucked from Philadelphia and New York art schools in early 1944. The small group of 1,100 men often pretended to be much bigger groups by using massive speakers that could be heard for miles. They also sent fake radio transmissions to distract the enemy from actual missions, and they deployed phony observation planes and handmade blow-up tanks to complete their schemes. The members of the Ghost Army sewed on counterfeit patches to hide from enemy spies. This also allowed them to pretend to be other units if necessary. Interestingly, the majority of the U.S. Army was unaware of the Ghost Army's existence until former soldier Arthur Shilstone wrote about his experience in 1985. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops Soldier Unit was the first mobile, tactical deception multimedia unit in U.S. history. It was composed of 1,023 men and 82 officers under the command of Colonel Harry L. Reeder. In total, the Ghost Army participated in 22 large-scale deceptions throughout Europe. And at number 1, glowing wounds. This last story is a bit older than the rest, going back to the Civil War. In 1862, something strange happened at the Battle of Shiloh, a fight which caused heavy losses on both sides. Under the cover of darkness, several soldiers' wounds started to glow. Open, bleeding injuries emitted a dull light that shined a greenish-blue color. The battle happened in southern Tennessee, where wounded soldiers were left in the rain and mud for as long as 48 hours before they were looked at by medics. And due to the great number of wounded soldiers, medical facilities were overwhelmed. For this reason, men were left in agony for 2 nights as they watched their wounds glow. And since the soldiers who glowed were expected to live longer than their non-glowing counterparts, this phenomenon was named Angel's Glow. For a while, this odd event was a mystery and was left in history as nothing but a bizarre war story passed down through generations. But in 2001, the mystery of the glowing wounds was finally solved when 2 high schoolers took it upon themselves to find the source of the blue-green light. Bill Martin and his friend Jonathan Curtis discovered that nematodes, small parasitic worms that live in plants and soil, were the cause of the soldiers' glowing injuries. Apparently, nematodes shine and make their homes in cool, moist environments. Nematodes survive by throwing up bacteria that kill other microorganisms. This is a survival mechanism the worms use to fight off anything that might compete for living spaces or food sources. In other words, by having this bacteria in their wounds, soldiers were able to fight off more harmful bacteria that could have caused infection. Do you know any other crazy wartime stories? Let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.